Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
And I'm Jenny Dietrich.
Jenny, you're fired.
Dang it.
Right after this.
Every week, either you quit or I get fired.
Yeah.
This happens every week.
And yet
somehow stop showing up.
Somehow we keep recording. So
I keep showing up. I'm going to tell Jen not to send me the link anymore.
There you go. It is what it is, you know. But I got to say something to try to keep people listening. You know,
Fair.
you got to capture them in that first moment when they're watching the video or clicking on the download link and listening to it in their car or at the gym or on their bicycle or wherever they're at. So, yeah. So, okay, I'm not actually going to fire you, but I did think it was a good intro to the topic that you came up with based on a message that you had read in a discussion forum where there was an owner who was struggling with a recent termination and both what it meant for that individual termination as well as what it means for trusting employees going forward.
Yeah, I mean, without betraying any confidences, there was a conversation about how someone had been fired and the agency owner learned after the person was fired that he had done a lot of egregious things such as downloading contracts, using the agency's time and resources to service his own clients and things like that. And, you know, I think we all struggle with people in general and, you know, bad hires and what you do when you have a bad hire. And, you know, I think a lot of us tend to look inwardly to say, okay, where did I make the mistake and where did I go wrong? But also sometimes people like pull the wool over your eyes and they're bad people and it has nothing to do with you. So, you know, I think there are times when certainly you've made a bad hire because you've ignored red flags, just like you might take on a new client because you've ignored red flags. And sometimes stuff just happens.
Yeah. And, you know, so you have to be careful that you don't beat yourself up about these things, right?
Yes.
To that point. At the same time, you do need to take lessons from each of them to try to figure out what you might do differently in the future, either in your hiring process, your management process, or in the process you used for termination, because there's always, as unpleasant as these circumstances can be, there's always something that you can take away from it that will help you to be a better business owner, manager, leader in the future.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, from the conversation or the discussion that happened, one of the things that I was reminded of is just to check my employment contracts, because I was pretty sure that our employment contracts say things like you can't moonlight and you can't, you know, without prior approval, and you can't do those things. And certainly that doesn't stop somebody from doing it if they're going to do it, but it does remind the honest people that, and hopefully you're mostly hiring honest people, that they can't do those things without prior approval. Now, I don't care. And as long as somebody comes to me and says, hey, listen, I want to freelance write for this publication, or, you know, my brother owns a shoe company and I'd like to do PR for him, whatever happens to be, where it doesn't conflict with the work that we do. Great. Thank you for telling me. And as long as it doesn't affect your work during the day, I have no problem with it. But, you know, I think I did actually go back and look at our employment contract to make sure it does say that in there, because that's one of the things that we require, is that you have that conversation. And that's not to say that everyone will. I mean, like I said, if you've hired somebody who's dishonest and they've pulled the wool over your eyes, or you've ignored red flags, they may still do it, but at least you've covered it with 90% or 95% of your employees.
Right. I mean, you know, fundamentally, dishonest people are going to be dishonest. So you can only protect yourself so much. You do want to put guideposts in there, guardrails in there for those employees who are inclined to do the right thing, but, you know, maybe they're not certain. And so you can give them that framework to live within so that, you know, they don't inadvertently do something that you would not be happy with. And obviously, to the extent that you have these policies in writing, it gives you leverage. It gives you something to hang your hat on if something goes south, right? So either you can use it to resolve the situation or to potentially head off, you know, other adverse consequences down the road. The one thing I will say, because you've referenced employment contracts, is be sure to consult with your legal counsel and HR consultant about the proper structure.
Yes,
I personally don't like employment contracts for anything except the most senior employees. I much prefer an offer letter and employee handbook framework for it, but you will get different advice from different professionals. You need to make sure the ones you're working with have reviewed and vetted what you're
Yes.
doing to make sure that you're not actually creating more problems than you're solving. Because if you
Right.
kind of do it just based on a few Google searches or something you hear on this show, you may end up putting yourself in a box that you don't want to be in. So,
Or my favorite is, hey, does anybody have an employment contract I can borrow? And then you get a whole bunch from your friends, and then you just make a copy and make it your own. Don't do that.
oh, and I've seen some really crazy things. One instance where an agency had taken an employment contract from an overseas firm and used that in the US.
Oh,
And so now you had the mess of an employment contract, but also with all sorts of weird provisions in there that referenced laws and regulations that
that don't exist here.
exist. And so how do you even end up interpreting that? I couldn't even begin to tell you. So
Interesting.
so be really, obviously that's an obvious example and one that anyone should catch, but there will be others where, you borrow something from a firm that's in California and you're not, or vice
Right.
versa, right? The
Right.
worst is if you're in California, you borrow one from somewhere else and you're probably definitely sticking
Yeah.
your toe in a place you don't want to be. So do be careful about that, but do make sure that you have these policies and make sure that you're being clear about the expectations about what employees can and cannot do, whether that's with moonlighting or their social media accounts or anything, right? If it's something that concerns you, you should have a policy around it to make
Sure.
sure that everybody understands. And again, have your professionals vet it to make sure that your expectation is actually legal, right? That you're not trying to tell them they can't do something that you have no ability to tell them they can't do. A great example of that is you can't have a policy that they can't badmouth you, right? In most cases, that actually violates at least here in the US, federal regulation, right? Employees have the right to complain about their employer as long as, they're doing it within certain bounds. So you can't tell them they can't do that. In all likelihood, again, check with your own legal counsel. But those are the kinds of things that you want to be aware of, that you're setting rules that are actually enforceable.
So let's talk about how you might avoid a problem hire, like this friend of mine posted about, finding out later that he was doing work for family members and for friends, using the not only using the firm's resources and time, but also their logo and their letterhead and all of that. So, which is highly unethical. So how do you interview for those kinds of people to sort of vet them out or discover the red flags?
I mean, it's really hard, right? I mean, it's like vetting a new client. We hire people based on too little information. We work with clients based on too little information. At the same time, you can't really get enough information in a reasonable process that that's ever going to come to a conclusion, right? I mean, if I'm hiring somebody, what have I talked to them for? I mean, me personally as the owner, particularly if I've got multiple employees, I've probably talked to that new hire for an hour or less. Right?
Yeah, that's fair. That's really fair.
If I am the owner and the manager, maybe I've talked to them for 2 or 3 hours tops,
Yep.
right before I make a decision. You don't know enough about somebody in that window of time. And sure, you can check references, but I think we've talked previously about how I think that's almost pointless because, I mean, only an absolute moron gives you someone who's going to give a bad reference.
Right.
So,
Yes.
I'm not sure, what you've achieved by doing that. I mean, certainly it's probably best practice to keep doing it anyway, but in my whole career, I can't tell you of any time I've called a reference and gotten a bad reference for somebody, right? Because you don't give those names, right? The people who are going to say, yeah, I've had ones where people called me, but they were not ones where I agreed to be a reference.
That's right. I was just going to say that. Yes.
So that is
Yes.
different, right?
That
And
is
so you
different.
certainly
Yes.
can use that.
Yes.
You can, if you know someone who
That's
knows
right.
the person, but you also have to be careful about that because you don't want to burn somebody who maybe their whole network doesn't know that they're looking for a job, right? And so, you don't know, you call someone and all of a sudden it turns out that they let that person's boss know. Now you've hurt them. So you got to be a little bit cautious about those kinds of things just to be respectful of people who are interviewing with you. But if you know somebody, that's a much better reference than
Yep.
one that you've been provided by the potential new hire.
Yep.
I mean, how you find these people is also an influence, right? I mean, if I get a recommendation from a current employee, I have much higher confidence in them because most people aren't going to recommend that a bad apple come in and work with them, right? Because that looks bad to them. It hurts overall. So they're not going to do it. So there are things you can do, but at the end of the day, it's still a gamble. No matter how well you think you know somebody. I think we've all had people in our lives that we were shocked when they did something in terms of misbehavior. We're like, wow, I never would have guessed that so and so would ever do something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
So it happens.
I hired somebody who worked for Edelman for 20 years and had glowing references. She was not a good employee at all. So like even still, even that, and I did what you said. Like I called people I knew, not just the references she provided. I called people I knew, and everyone talked they said wonderful things. Everyone did.
Right.
She ended up being a really terrible employee. She stole from us. She was really bad. But I didn't get any of that. When you work for Edelman for 20 years, you just assume that she knows the business, she knows the industry. She worked at the highest levels of the agency there, and she was a very, very, very bad employee. And no one told me. No one told me she got fired. No one. So you can do your due diligence and still not get all of the information that you need.
Well, that's the other thing to keep in mind too is, sometimes people want to get rid of their own bad apples. And so they may not be as upfront with you because they're like, oh God, let it be Chip's problem now. That's great.
Right. No longer my problem. Bye-bye.
We've all had employees over the years. We're like, oh, they're going to leave. Oh, that would solve so many problems if they just went somewhere else. Then I don't actually have to deal with firing them. And
yeah.
wow. So and so's looking, I've got somebody who might be a good fit for you. So yeah, I mean, you got to be careful. And look, I mean, there are plenty of good people who are bad employees and vice versa, right?
Sure.
So
yeah.
Trying to figure it all out is a challenge. I think the most important thing is to make sure that you have systems in place so that you can try to identify people who are misbehaving sooner rather than later. You want to have a culture where, not that people are ratting each other out, but if someone sees something, they should say something. And so, obviously if you're a very small shop, that's going to be more challenging, but you also have more visibility into what people are doing in your very small shop. So, but as you get bigger, make sure that people feel comfortable saying, yeah, so-and-so is, uses abusive language or expects things that are unreasonable of us, or all the many things that I've seen go wrong with managers and employees over the years.
So one of the things we talked about at the beginning was, trying not to take it personally or beat yourself up for it. So, and I think that's hard. So let's talk for a few minutes about, how to handle, letting somebody bad go or somebody incompetent go and not taking it personally.
Yeah. And so I think this is one of those ones where you do have to be very careful to try to take as much emotion out of it as possible, because emotion only leads to bad places when it comes to terminations. And we've talked in the past about terminations generally and that kind of thing, but if I recall correctly from this particular instance, there was some discussion about whether or not it would be a for-cause termination.
Mm-hmm.
Always be careful with for-cause terminations. For-cause terminations frequently come about because of an emotional response from the owner or manager. And I know this because I've done a very small number of for-cause terminations over the years. And every time I've done a for-cause termination, I've gotten angry before I did it, right? Because it's not like, if it's for cause, that means that someone has, demonstrably violated some policy or done something so egregious that you feel like you have no choice. And I think the first thing to do is to try to, if you can, put some distance between that emotion and the final, meeting to do the termination, or the decision even to do the termination, right? To make sure that you're not allowing the emotion to overcome you, and that what you've observed, what you believe has happened, actually did happen, and actually was as egregious as you thought. Because I will tell you that on a couple of occasions with for-cause terminations, given a few weeks of reflection, were they fireable offenses? Absolutely. Did they need to be done as for-cause? Probably not. Probably could have done them as regular termination, and that then takes a lot of the emotion on both sides out of the equation.
So the difference between a regular termination and for cause is one comes with severance and
typically
not burning bridges, and for cause typically does not.
Correct. I mean, when you do for cause, typically you withhold severance.
Yep.
Typically you would, and so as a result, you're stating the cause, right? And so one of the things that we've talked about in the past when doing terminations is that you should avoid getting into specifics. For cause, you have to get into specifics because you're explaining the reason why we are, being, so firm in this action, right? And for cause also carries with it certain implications potentially when it comes to unemployment or things like that, depending on local rules and regulations and all that kind of thing. So you need to be careful about it. And so unless it is so black and white that there's no other option, I would stay away from for cause. I think the trouble is simply not worth it in 99 out of 100 cases.
And what do you think, just in your opinion, and I have some thoughts too, but what, in your opinion, what are for cause? Things like harassment?
Sure. I mean, for cause to me at this point, things that I would say absolutely need to remain in for cause would be anything where it's, a clear violation of law or regulation, something where it, is some sort of clear harassment of some kind, something where it is an extensive misappropriation of agency resources, right? I mean, embezzlement, something like that.
Mhm,
Not
mhm.
like, I mean, in the case that you described where someone's, doing sort of, daylighting, I'd be really I mean, it would depend on what it was, but it'd have to be pretty egregious. If it's for friends and family, I'm not treating that as a for cause, honestly.
Right.
If it's for a potential client or something like that, or there's confidential information being disclosed, okay, maybe, right? Then I might start thinking about it. But to me, it has to be a pretty high bar. I think, for me, the one for cause termination that I would emphatically stick with was over the course of my career, and would never put into a different category, was someone who had been clearly warned the week before not to engage in certain activity and continued to do it after that clear warning.
Stupid.
Right? I mean, at that point, you are now completely questioning all of my authority, and so
Right.
I really have no choice. You violated a written rule that you were given a warning on.
Yep.
See ya. Bye.
Yep.
But in general, I think you need to have a pretty high bar for it these days.
Interesting. So laws, regulations, that kind of stuff, it's for cause, and things like using your firm's resources, although not definitely fireable, but it's not for cause.
Yeah, I think if it takes more than a sentence to explain why you've done the for cause to a layperson,
Love it.
then you probably don't need to do it for cause, right? Because like daylighting, try to explain that to an average person, right?
Right.
They're going to be like, well, what's the big deal? I make phone calls and stuff on off. I use my email, but if it's, so-and-so was harassing another employee. Okay, cool. Yeah. Everybody gets that instantly.
Yep.
No explanation needed. So I think if you use that test, if you can explain it in one sentence, to your mom or dad, you're probably good.
Okay. So I have a question.
Oh boy.
As you know, I'm 20,000 years behind the rest of the world, and I just started watching Succession. And there's an episode in which Tom uses one of his employees as a footstool. Cause or not cause?
Oh, that's absolutely cause. but at that point, by that point, he's done so many. I mean, all of the characters in that show have done so many things that should be for cause terminations. Yeah, that's probably not your best.
I was like, you can't. What is happening? You're using an employee as a footstool. They just. Oh,
yeah, I don't remember that particular episode, but I assume that was Greg, right? Who was the footstool?
No, Greg actually walked in to see it happening. And Greg was like, I don't know what's going on.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Poor Greg.
Yeah, poor Greg. What are you going to do? Yeah, no, but I mean, I think that you have to be careful with these for causes because they're usually just not worth the trouble. And so just, pay 2-4 week severance, something like that. Try to make it as clean an exit as possible.
Yeah.
Move on and take your lessons from it. Right. Because I think, another function of this discussion was, the ability to trust future hires, right? Because you've gotten burned once, and you're absolutely going to be concerned about it. And it will take time for that to fade. That next hire, you're going to be watching much more carefully, which is good and bad. Right. Because you have to be careful that the lesson you take away is not that you need to micromanage and become obsessively involved. So, I mean, I suspect, I know I've had terminations where it does cause me to really go in the wrong direction with the next hire. I don't know if you've had the same experience, but it's, it's very easy to overcorrect. Yep. It's like, driving on the ice in the winter, or something that I guess you don't really drive, so you can't appreciate it.
I do now. Since the pandemic, I do.
Since the pandemic, you do. Okay. in any case, in cold climates, when you're on the ice, you have to be careful about, oversteering to
Overcorrecting. Yep.
correct, because that's when you
Yep.
start spinning around in circles.
Yep.
And so it's very much the same when you're dealing with setbacks in the business. You don't want to overcorrect, because that's when you start making a bad situation even worse.
Yeah, people, and this is what I said in the discussion. I said, people are hard. This is the hardest part of our job. If we didn't have the people part, life would be grand. But you can't take it personally. We all make mistakes. I think we all look for this. Will definitely be a good learning. It was a good learning for the rest of us in the conversation too. Like I said, I immediately went and reviewed our employment contracts just to make sure that I'm covering my agency from that perspective. So I think we all have an opportunity to learn, but you're right. We can't, and it's really hard to do this. It's easier said than done, but
yeah,
you can't take it personally.
No, and we need to remind ourselves that most people that we hire are not inherently evil and dishonest.
That's right.
Right. More than a small number may end up being incompetent or not up to our expectation or something like that. But there is a huge difference. And so you need to get good as you manage more people at really identifying, who are the select few who are evil and dishonest versus who, maybe just needs, a little coaching, or maybe needs to move on, but it doesn't need to be done so in an adversarial fashion.
Yeah.
And I think you will find that more things fall into that bucket. And I think if you come at things and you simply assume this person is simply incompetent, or simply didn't understand what to do, or what have you, and only allow yourself to later be convinced that they did it because they are evil and dishonest, I think you will be in a better place, right? So always cast things in that best light possible, that maybe you didn't communicate the expectations correctly, and so that's why it happened. And only once you're like, nope, I know for certain that I communicated this and there was no ambiguity and I know they understood it. Now that's where you can start looking at cause.
People. It's the hardest part of our jobs.
It is, and it's people internally, it's people on the client side. I mean, agency world is a people business, and so you've got to have patience and thick skin, and the resilience to keep trying again when something doesn't work, because you will have failed employees, you will have failed client engagements, and
that's right.
And if you are going into the agency world thinking that is not going to happen, we're going to be very disappointed, probably sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it's really hard, but you're right. It's a great way to learn. It's a great way to learn.
So hopefully people have learned from this conversation. And if not, you can fire us by simply unsubscribing to this podcast.
I feel like you're supposed to do the opposite. If you enjoyed this conversation or you learned something, please subscribe.
Well, I'm operating under the assumption that anyone who stuck with us this long actually did find they were getting something from it. I mean,
that's fair.
If not, we can't help you anyway, so go ahead and unsubscribe, because if you spent 22 minutes listening to us thinking these people are idiots, they have no clue what they're talking about, you need therapy of some sort. You don't need business coaching. We can't help you. So,
well, on that note,
thanks for joining us. We'll be back with you soon. I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Jenny Dietrich.
And it depends.